Hello. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about the ego. Now, to preface this video, the ego can be explained in a more scientific way. There's the Freudian ego, which is essentially a construction of an identity. I guess the identity that you present to the rest of the world. There's the more esoteric way of looking at the ego, which is sort of the attachment of not the self, but of something else that sort of tethers us to the material, to vices, to quick fixes, things of that nature. I also want to start off by saying I am aware I have an ego, quite a big one at that. I am a filmmaker. I am a creative type. I do acting. I've done stand-up comedy, and that requires a lot of ego. I always joke about how, of course, I want to be a performer because I never felt I got enough attention as a child. So that was my way of sort of making up for that. The thing about knowing that I have an ego is I've had enough people in my life sort of tell me that I just want to be right. I am very, very stubborn. There might be a point to what they're saying, to their accusations. I am not a perfect being. I realize how incredibly human I am, and with that humanity there comes flaws, and the ego sort of helps protect our emotions from perceived outside forces. I am not a psychologist or studied psychiatry or anything of that nature. I've read on it. I've taken a few courses. This is more about my personal observations on what the ego is. I'm also looking at the ego through a more, I guess, spiritual lens as opposed to just an academic one. I think that humans developed when it came to interacting with each other, once they started creating social groups for survival, because I do think that humans still have that hunter instinct or those more primitive instincts. I think that's still part of our brain construct. We learned not just how to hunt, but we learned agriculture. We learned how to take advantage of the environment around us, and we learned how to form communities. I think as humanity advanced, our ideas started changing. We developed the ego. I could be completely wrong about this, but I think there's a reason why the ego came about. I think the ego was, when it comes to being in society, I think the ego protects us the way our primitive instincts would protect us from danger, from predators. It makes us competitive because we had to fight for resources in order to stay alive. And the ego has sort of taken the place of that because we're not fighting for survival in the same way we used to, but we still perceive dangers, social dangers. We don't like to be embarrassed. We don't like to feel vulnerable around people. We want to be smart because in a society, all of these traits, while not necessarily physical, are very important. They create strong leaders. They're what people kind of look up to in society. So when you have the ego trying to make you out to be, I guess, greater than how you feel you are on the inside, it is a way to preserve a bit of social control, because in society, if you're not part of it, then you don't get to reap the same benefits of it. So I definitely think the ego has its purpose. I do think that the ego shouldn't ever be driving the car, but it should probably be in the back seat every now and then telling you that was the turn. Oh, okay, cool. Don't let the ego dictate everything, because the ego serves a very limited purpose, at least in my understanding. The ego is able to preserve you, but it doesn't really help you grow. You could argue that some animals have an ego. I definitely think that more domesticated animals or animals that are more non-human people, like dolphins and chimpanzees, that might not be the right term. But I think these animals do have a certain sense of ego because they're a little bit more evolved. They have a certain hierarchy in their society that isn't just instinctive. Not that they learned it from us, but I think that's just the way a more advanced species would sort of develop. I mean, look at dogs. There's a whole thing with dog shaming that was big for a while, and as a dog owner, and even as a cat owner, when I get mad at them, they understand that they did something wrong. They feel shame. The shame is part of the ego. And because we have that attachment, because they're so dependent on us for survival, I feel that's where the ego sort of manifested. Because if they're not pleasing their owner, then, or their human, then they're, maybe they're not going to get fed, or they're not going to get the same amount of love, and the dynamic changes. I definitely see that in my two cats, the way they compete for food. Because I have one fat cat that likes to eat the other fat cat's food. It doesn't really make sense because they're both getting fed by the same source, but they're very jealous, they're very territorial. And I think that's a carryover from when they were feral. And now it's more of a, well, we have to please the human. We have to be all lovey-dovey. We sometimes don't like each other because they have personalities, and I think personality is also part of what helps develop the ego. Or they're kind of correlated. Where I find that the ego is detrimental a lot of the times is, and again, I'm not a psychologist or a neuroscientist, but I think that there's a connection between feeding the ego and getting that dopamine hit. Just getting, it's something that will satisfy you in the short run, but ultimately isn't very self-sustainable. And what I mean by that is you might be getting accolades from people and you believe it because it makes you feel good. It doesn't just make the nebulous ego feel good. It literally releases a chemical in your brain that makes you feel good, even if it's just for that moment. I honestly believe that's why a lot of celebrities or people who are just trying to get famous for the sake of being famous, not for talent, not for hard work, but just, I guess, sort of being in the right place at the right time, they are feeding their ego in a more negative way because they're not really earning things, they just are. And it becomes addictive, which is why people can't handle it a lot of the times, because you have to have a strong sense of self, of actual self, not an ego that's sort of this construct of who you want people to think you are. Let's talk a little bit more about how the ego affects people's behavior. So we have people being stubborn, and I think they're stubborn in a lot of ways because they don't want to be seen as wrong. They don't want to be seen as stupid, again, because that devaluates their social currency. But I don't think that it really matters because we're all smart and we're all stupid in some way or another. That's just the bottom line. I don't consider myself an idiot by any means, but I've done some pretty dumb things, even though my ego for the longest time wouldn't allow me to be truthful about that, because I listen to the ego sort of like an overbearing parent and then just say, okay, I heard what you have to say, but you don't have to do what your ego says. You can listen to it. In fact, I suggest you listen to your ego. It's a part of you. But just say, okay, all right, I heard you. I take that into consideration, and just do what you need to do. A lot of people don't like being humiliated. I've talked about in another video about how growing up I was bullied. I was bullied physically a little bit, but mostly it was mocking, name calling, jokes, things of that nature. And me being a sensitive kid and a sensitive myself, as far as I'm very empathic and intuitive, I took that very personally. I didn't understand why people were so mean to me. For the longest time, I was a victim because I was letting my ego sort of feast on these emotions, and being a victim fed my ego. Because it didn't matter whether I failed or not, I was a victim, and I'm just doing the best I can. Nowadays, I look at it as I have my flaws. I understand I'm trying to work out those flaws. Some of them are things that are minor, a lot of it is subjective, and some of it is in the way that it affects my relationship with people, my own personal life. So a lot of that was just learning to let go of what I felt people thought of me, because it didn't really matter. To a certain extent, it does. You want the people closest to you to care about you and not make you feel a certain way, but it's really up to us whether we feel how we want to feel. And if we want to feel great, we feel great. And if we're comfortable with the misery, then our ego is going to latch onto that because it's going to make it feel good. I know it sounds counterintuitive, and I know it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And there are people who legitimately have chemical imbalances and things of that nature that make it more difficult for them to really be able to work out any depression or mental disorders. It's tough. I'm not saying this is everybody. But some people, they shoot themselves in the foot by being egotistical. So a lot of the times, stubbornness leads to cognitive dissonance. When I'm talking about cognitive dissonance, I'm talking about how I could be explaining something to somebody in what I feel is a very logical way, with facts and figures or statistics or what have you. It's not always a big production, but at least trying to talk about things calmly and rationally. They just give me the runaround, as far as not really giving me an answer, or the answer that they think they're giving me that's well thought out isn't, at least for my standards. And I ask them questions, or I talk to them very calmly, but try to get them to not change their mind, but to analyze their opinions, analyze why they feel the way they feel. I want them to shed the ego and really look within, not to dwell on this construct that they created, or that has been created for them because of circumstances. I was born in Mexico. I came out when I was very young. I'm a pagan. I'm an artist. I'm a whole lot of different things, and I don't cling to one specifically. There were moments in my life where, yes, pride was very important to me. American pride, Hispanic pride, gay pride. I kind of started analyzing pride aspect. I started analyzing that word, or why people felt pride in something that was circumstantial. It wasn't something that they at least consciously chose. There are beliefs that we choose the circumstances in which we are incarnated into every reality, but that's neither here nor there. What I'm talking about is, I didn't choose to be Mexican. I was born in Mexico. I didn't choose to be light-skinned. That was just a product of my genetics and my family history and people intermingling with each other. I don't think I chose to be gay. I have been back and forth with that. And now I've gotten to the point where most of the people in my life, honestly, they don't really care. They know that it's not the defining aspect of who I am. And none of the things that I am are the defining factor of who I am. So I kind of have learned to stop feeling pride for all of these things and just simply accepting it, because that's part of it. I accept that these are parts of me. They are not all of me, because that's a lot of identities to be. It's convoluted. It's not even who you are. It's just a part of you. And then I want to talk about the male ego. the fragile male ego, as it's often referred to, because I think that's kind of a cop-out. The reason I think it's a cop-out is because everybody has an ego. Sure, you want to say that men have a specific kind of ego? I'm on board with you because I've grown up with a lot of men and I've dated men. So I get their insecurities. And with women, I've grown up with a lot of women. A lot of them tell me things about their personal lives, so I get to understand them. And I don't think that the ego is bigger in one gender than another. I think it's an individual basis. I think every individual has their own ego, and I think it's up to us to check it. And I think letting go of the ego isn't so much saying, oh, just strip it away completely. Because one, that's really hard to do. And two, I don't think it's necessary for people to have to completely shed the ego, because I think it does serve its purpose. At least in this reality. Maybe in an ascended plane, then, we don't have a need for it. But at least here, we, instead of denying it, need to embrace it as the overbearing parent it is in our psyche. It'll try to protect you, sometimes to an annoying length. They try to protect your feelings, even if your feelings shouldn't be hurt. And as a comedian, I understand humor. And if we're talking about male ego, most men roast the hell out of each other. Me especially. When people make fun of me, I think it's great, as long as it's funny. That's the only thing I find offensive. If you come at me with a not funny joke. But if you're making fun of my identity, I don't care, because I am not my identity. I am me, and all of these things around me are the ego trying to gain some sort of social status. I think being virtuous in a lot of ways feeds into the ego, at least false virtue. When you have to continuously talk about how great you are, that's your ego trying to make up for the fact that deep down you probably don't like yourself that much, and that's something that you have to do. You have to work on the soft, gooey center more than you have to work on the construct, because that's only protecting you. It should not be the entire persona. It shouldn't be your entire being. So we need to be able to make peace with the ego the way you would an overbearing parent that sometimes you don't want to call, but you're like, okay, you know what? Sometimes they have good things to say, and I know they love me, and I know they're just trying to protect me. They might be going a little bit overboard and, going completely crazy trying to protect me, but it's there for a reason. It's there, honestly, to protect us. I definitely think that we should not let it dominate our lives the way it sometimes does. Anyway, thanks for watching.